The night Sarah Sutton laughed so hard she knocked over the lemonade table was the same night Homer Morgan decided, quietly and without fanfare, that he had never seen anything so magnificent in all his 31 years on this earth. It was the autumn of 1879, out in Caldwell, Kansas, a town that sat like a dusty jewel along the Kisham Trail, where cattle drives still rumbled through, and the smell of leather and wood smoke was as familiar as breathing. October had painted the surrounding plains in shades of amber and rust, and the whole community of Caldwell had turned out for the annual harvest dance, held in the wide-open barn belonging to the Whitmore family at the edge of town. Lanterns had been strung from the rafters in long amber chains, and someone had dragged in a fiddle player from Wichita named Old Pete Calloway, who could make a bow sing like a minister preaching to the converted. The wooden floor was thick with boots and petticoats, and the air smelled of dried corn husks, apple cider, and something faintly sweet that the Whitmore boys kept pouring from a jug they pretended was water. Homer Morgan sat on a barrel near the far wall with a tin cup of real cider, his hat pulled just slightly low, his broad shoulders settled into that particular stillness that made people forget he was even in the room. He was a cattleman by trade, working a modest spread 12 miles east of town, a place he had built with his own hands over 7 years of early mornings and blistered palms. He was not unfriendly. He simply had a way of listening to the world rather than talking at it, and in a town full of men who loved the sound of their own voices, that quality made him invisible to most and fascinating to precisely nobody. His brown hair was combed back neatly, and his jaw carried a day's worth of stubble that he had meant to shave before coming but had not found the time for, because the calves on the north pasture had needed attention and calves cared nothing for social appearances. He had come to the dance because his neighbor, Randall Prout, had refused to stop asking him. Randall was the kind of man who believed loneliness was a character flaw, and had appointed himself the unofficial guardian of Homer's social life, which Homer tolerated with more patience than he felt. So he had put on his cleanest shirt, a deep blue chambray that Mrs. Ellison at the dry goods store had told him brought out his eyes, and he had driven the 12 miles in his wagon with Randall talking the entire way, and he had found himself a barrel and his cup of cider and made a quiet peace with the noise. That was when Sarah Sutton arrived. She did not walk into the Whitmore barn so much as she entered it, the way a thunderstorm enters a valley, all at once and impossible to ignore. She was 26 years old, the daughter of the late Reverend Thomas Sutton and his equally late wife Clara, and she had been running her father's old homestead single-handedly for 2 years since consumption took him in the spring of 1877. She wore a dress the color of a summer cornflower, blue and bright against her dark red hair that she had pinned up on one side and let spill loose on the other, because that was how she did things, half orderly and half wild. She had green eyes that caught the lamplight like glass catching the sun, and she moved through the crowd with the unself-conscious ease of someone who genuinely liked people and had never once second-guessed whether they liked her back. "Martha Whitmore, your barn has never looked prettier," she announced, loud enough for half the barn to hear, and Martha Whitmore, a stout and contented woman in her 50s, blushed like a girl and swatted Sarah on the arm with genuine affection. "Sarah Sutton, you are the only woman I know who can make a compliment sound like a celebration," Martha said, and pulled her into a hug that nearly displaced Sarah's carefully arranged hair. Homer watched all of this without meaning to. He watched her greet 3 more people in the span of 2 minutes, calling each one by name, asking after a child, a harvest, a sick cow with the kind of specific interest that told you she actually remembered what you had told her last time. He watched her accept a cup of cider from old Pete Calloway's grandson without drinking it yet, because she was too busy laughing at something the Donovan brothers had said. Her laugh was remarkable. It was loud, honest, unguarded, the kind of laugh that had no performance in it, that came from the belly and escaped without permission, and the people around her laughed louder just because of it. Homer took a sip of his cider and looked at the barn floor. He was not the kind of man who introduced himself to women at harvest dances. He was not sure he had ever done it, not once in his adult life. Women came into his world through practical paths, through business, through necessity, through Randall Pruitt's relentless social engineering, and he was comfortable with that. Or he had been until approximately 6 minutes ago. The fiddle started up a reel, and the floor filled immediately with couples spinning and stomping, and Sarah Sutton was pulled into the middle of it by a cheerful young man Homer recognized as Bill Hartley, the blacksmith's son, who danced with the enthusiasm of someone who had learned by watching horses and considered that sufficient. Sarah laughed through the whole reel, even when Bill stepped on her foot twice, even when the turn went too fast and she nearly collided with the Donovan brothers, even when her hair came completely unpinned on both sides and she had to stop at the edge of the floor to push it back. She pinned it up with the fierce efficiency of a woman who had done it 100 times in a hurry and then spun right back onto the floor for the next reel. Homer watched her. He did not even try to stop watching her. The evening moved on in the way evenings do when they are loud and warm and full of people who are glad to see each other. The lemonade table, which sat to the left of the refreshment spread, became the site of the incident that fixed Homer's attention completely and entirely. Sarah had been telling a story apparently involving a runaway pig and the town's new schoolteacher, and she had reached the climactic moment of the tale, her arms wide, her green eyes bright, and she took one enthusiastic step backward while punctuating the point, and her elbow caught the pitcher on the lemonade table, and the whole thing went sideways. The pitcher, the cup stack, and the tablecloth, in a magnificent cascade that stopped the dancing within 10 feet and made at least 6 people gasp. There was a single breath of silence, and then Sarah Sutton threw her head back and laughed harder than anyone else in the barn, her hands pressed to her cheeks, her shoulders shaking, her cornflower blue dress spotted with lemonade, and the whole barn dissolved with her until even the fiddler stopped playing because he was laughing too hard to draw the bow. "I'll replace the pitcher," she called out through her laughter, to no one and everyone, and Martha Whitmore was already waving her hand like it was nothing at all. Homer realized his cup was empty. He realized he had been holding it without drinking for the past 20 minutes. He set it down carefully on the barrel beside him and wondered what in the world was wrong with him. Randall appeared at his elbow with the timing of a man who had been watching. "That there is Sarah Sutton," Randall said, helpfully and unnecessarily. "I know who she is," Homer said, which was true in the way that knowing a person's name and knowing a person were two entirely different things. He had seen Sarah Sutton in town a dozen times. He had tipped his hat to her outside the dry goods store. She had smiled, bright and automatic, the way she smiled at everyone. He had not thought much of it at the time, or told himself he had not. "She's had a rough go of it," Randall said, keeping his voice low. "Lost her father couple years back, running that homestead by herself. It's a good piece of land, but it's a lot for one person. Woman's got more backbone than most men I know, but she won't say so." Homer looked at Randall. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've been staring at her for an hour and you haven't moved an inch," Randall said pleasantly, "and I'm a charitable man." Homer opened his mouth. He closed it. He picked up his empty cup again. Randall smiled and walked away. The night deepened. More reels were played. The apple cider jug made several more rounds. Couples drifted out into the cool October air and came back flushed with cold and laughter. The Donovan brothers got into a mild disagreement about the proper way to two-step that ended in a demonstration that satisfied neither of them. Children fell asleep in the hay along the walls and were draped in coats by their mothers. The crowd slowly, naturally, began to thin. By 10 o'clock, several families with small children had said their good nights. By 11, the older couples and the men with early morning obligations had followed. Old Pete Calloway played slower songs now, sweet and meandering, the kind of music that suited the tail end of a celebration. The lanterns still burned steady and warm, and the remaining dozen or so people moved at a gentler pace, talking in small clusters, leaning against the barn walls in comfortable exhaustion. Sarah Sutton was still in the center of it. She had always been in the center of it, not because she demanded it, but because warmth draws people and she was warm. She was talking to Martha Whitmore now, her shoes in her hand, because she had taken them off an hour ago to dance barefoot on the wooden floor, her dark red hair loose around her shoulders, where the pins had finally surrendered entirely. She was laughing at something Martha had said, a smaller laugh now, softer, the kind that comes when you are tired and happy and the night has been good. Homer had not left. He had told himself several times he was about to leave. He had put his hat on twice and taken it off twice. Randall had left at 10:30 with a knowing look and no comment, which was so unlike Randall that Homer almost respected it. The barrel he was sitting on had become uncomfortable around 9, and he had shifted to leaning against the barn wall, one boot crossed over the other, in the posture of a man trying very hard to look like he was not waiting for something specific. And then Martha Whitmore said her own good night, hugging Sarah long and warmly, and pressing something into her hands that looked like a wrapped piece of pie. And the last few remaining guests began to move toward the door, pulling on coats and calling quiet farewells, and the fiddle player packed up his instrument with the gentle care of a man who loved it, and the Whitmore boys went around blowing out the lower lanterns, and the barn settled into a warm, dimmer quiet. Sarah Sutton turned around and found that she and Homer Morgan were the only two people left. She tilted her head. She looked at him the way you look at something that surprises you pleasantly, with curiosity more than anything else. He was still against the wall, hat in his hands now because he had not yet decided what to do with it, his blue shirt catching what remained of the lantern light. "You've been over there all night," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, offered with the frank directness of a woman who had never seen the point of pretending she had not noticed something. "I have," Homer said. It came out steadier than he expected. She walked toward him, still barefoot, her shoes swinging from her left hand, the wrapped piece of pie in her right. She stopped about 4 feet away and looked up at him with those remarkable green eyes, and there was something in her expression that was not just curiosity anymore, something quieter and more careful. "You're Homer Morgan," she said. "You have the cattle spread out east, Randall Pruitt's neighbor." "That's right," he said. "I've seen you in town." She paused. "You always look like you're listening to something nobody else can hear." He blinked. He had not expected that. "I suppose I might," he said after a moment. She smiled, and it was different from the wide public smile he had been watching all evening. It was smaller, more honest, the kind of smile you give when you are not performing anything. "I'm Sarah Sutton," she said. "I know," he said. A single lantern still burned overhead, swaying very slightly in the draft from the open barn door, and somewhere outside an owl called once and went quiet. "Well, Homer Morgan," she said, "it appears we are the last ones here, which means it is midnight and we both either live very far away or we are both procrastinating." 12 miles east," he said. 8 miles north," she said. "You drove yourself." "I always drive myself," she said without defensiveness, just as simple fact. He nodded. He looked at her for a moment, at the loose red hair and the tired green eyes and the shoes hanging from her fingers, and he said, "Can I walk you to your wagon?" It was perhaps the longest sentence he had offered anyone all evening, and he felt the weight of it in his chest the way you feel the weight of something you have been holding for a while and have finally set down. She smiled again, the small, honest one. "I would like that," she said. They walked out of the Whitmore barn together into the October night, and the air was cold and smelled of dry grass and the far-off promise of November, and the stars over the Kansas prairie were so thick and bright they seemed almost close enough to touch. Sarah put her shoes back on at the barn door, sitting on the step and wrestling with the laces with cheerful impatience, and Homer stood beside her and waited without saying anything, because he was good at waiting. The walk to the wagon took 4 minutes. 4 minutes in which neither of them said very much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of a silence between people who are thinking the same thing and are not yet sure they should say so. At the wagon, she turned to face him. The moonlight found her hair and made it something extraordinary. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. She climbed up to the seat with practiced ease, gathering the reins. Then she looked down at him with an expression that was considering something. "Homer Morgan," she said, "do you ever come to town on a Saturday?" "Sometimes," he said. "I'll be at the dry goods store this Saturday," she said. Around midday, she looked at him steadily. "I just thought you should know." He looked up at her. "I'll remember that," he said. She nodded once, a small decisive nod, and then she clicked her tongue at the horse and the wagon rolled away into the dark. And Homer Morgan stood in the field beside the Whitmore barn and listened to the owl that had started calling again and thought that he had not breathed properly in at least 3 minutes. He drove home through the dark plains with the stars wheeling overhead, and he did not think about the cattle or the north pasture or the fence that needed mending along the creek. He thought about a woman who had knocked over a lemonade table and laughed harder than anyone, and who had looked at him with eyes the color of new grass, and said she would be at the dry goods store on Saturday around midday. And he thought, with the quiet certainty that was the only kind of certainty he knew, that Saturday could not possibly come fast enough. He was there at 11:30. He had told himself he would arrive at noon, at exactly noon, and he had driven 6 miles before he accepted that noon was not going to happen, and turned the horse toward town at a pace that Randall Prout, had he witnessed it, would have found extremely informative. Sarah Sutton was already at the dry goods store when he walked in, which meant she had also arrived early, though he did not allow himself to read too much into that. She was standing at the counter discussing the price of flour with Mr. Ellison, her basket on her arm, and she was wearing a brown dress today, practical and clean, with her hair in a proper braid that told him she had taken more time this morning than the harvest dance arrangement had suggested. When the door opened and Homer walked in, she looked over her shoulder, and the expression that crossed her face before she could compose it was unmistakably pleased. "Mr. Morgan," she said. "Miss Sutton," he said, and took his hat off, which he did for very few people without thinking. They ended up walking together down the main street of Caldwell with their respective purchases, and the conversation that began as polite and careful gradually became something else entirely over the course of 2 blocks. She asked about his cattle operation, asking real questions that showed she understood what she was asking about, questions about bloodlines and winter fodder, and whether he had considered the new grass-fed approach some ranchers were experimenting with. He answered her with more words than he typically assembled in public, surprised by how easy it was, and then he asked about her homestead, and she told him about the kitchen garden and the single milk cow and the beehives her father had established, and that she maintained with what she called aggressive optimism and only moderate stinging. He laughed at that. It was a quiet laugh contained, but it was genuine, and she looked at him sideways when it happened, pleased. They stopped at the end of the street where their directions diverged, and he realized that 30 minutes had passed and it had felt like 4. "This was nice," she said simply. "It was," he agreed. She looked at him with that frank directness. "I have a fence post that's been giving me trouble," she said. "On the east side of my property, it keeps leaning, and I've straightened it 4 times and it keeps leaning." He considered this. "Ground might be too soft there, needs a wider base." "That's what I thought," she said, "but I wasn't entirely sure. You've been building fences longer than I have." He heard what was underneath that, or thought he did. He looked at her carefully. "I could come take a look," he said. "Next week if the weather holds." She met his eyes. "Thursday," she said. "Come for lunch." He was there Wednesday evening, parked half a mile from her property, talking himself into leaving and then not leaving, until the sun went low enough that he turned back home and arrived at midnight feeling foolish in a way he had not felt since he was young. He was there Thursday at 10 in the morning. She opened the door and looked at him and then looked at the sun and said, "You're early." "I know," he said. She stepped back and let him in. The homestead was precisely what he would have expected if he had thought about it, which he had, a great deal, on Wednesday evening parked half a mile away. It was neat and deliberate, every object with a purpose, the kitchen garden visible through the window in careful autumn rows, the bookshelves beside the fireplace double-stacked with volumes that had been read so many times their spines were creased white. There was a jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill, because she was practical but not entirely without sentiment, and there was a piece of music on the small, upright piano against the wall, a hymn that her father had apparently loved. She made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and talked, and this time the talking came easier, the way a river comes easier once you have found the channel. She told him about growing up as a reverend's daughter in Caldwell, about learning to manage accounts when she was 12 because her father was good with souls and terrible with numbers. She told him about the morning she had found her father ill and the year it had taken him, slowly and with great dignity, and the way the congregation had come together to help her in the months after, bringing food and labor and kindness that she had accepted without shame because she understood, as her father had taught her, that receiving grace graciously was its own form of generosity. He told her about Missouri, where he had grown up, and the farm that had belonged to his family, and the younger brother who still worked it. He told her about coming west at 24 with $200 and a horse named Fletcher, because he had known from the time he was a boy that his particular temperament was suited to wide open spaces and a quiet life built on his own terms. He had not meant to say that much, but she listened with her whole face, and something about her complete attention made words come that he did not know he had been carrying. They ate lunch, a simple meal of bread and cold roast and the last of the autumn tomatoes from her garden, and afterward he looked at the fence post and diagnosed the problem correctly on the first inspection. The base needed wider footings and the post itself was slightly rotten at the ground line. She had a spare post in the barn, and together they replaced it, working with the comfortable practicality of two people who knew how to work, and when they were done she stood back and looked at the straight post with visible satisfaction. "You were right about the base," she said. "You were right about what the problem was," he said. "You just needed the confirmation." She looked at him sideways again, the same look as Saturday on the street. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" he asked, genuinely curious. She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. "Someone quieter," she said. "The quiet ones either have nothing to say or a great deal they're waiting to say. I wasn't sure which you were." "Which am I?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, and the autumn wind moved through the long grass of her property, and somewhere the milk cow made a contented sound from the barn. "I think you have a great deal," she said, "and you choose very carefully who you say it to." He did not answer that, because there was nothing to answer. She was simply correct. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that, and by the third visit it had stopped being about any particular task or excuse and had simply become what they did. A Thursday that was his, hers, theirs. A day carved out of the week the way you carve a channel to let water run where you intend it. They worked alongside each other in the mornings, fixing what needed fixing, tending what needed tending, and they ate lunch at her kitchen table and talked in the afternoons, and he drove home in the early dark with the sense of a man returning from somewhere rather than merely going somewhere. She came to his spread one Sunday in November, not invited in any formal sense, but expected in the way that by then most things between them had become expected without needing to be spoken aloud. She walked through the barn with the eye of someone who knew what good animal husbandry looked like, and told him he was doing it correctly, which he already knew, but which was unexpectedly satisfying to hear from her. He showed her the north pasture and the creek and the rise of land to the east where you could see 3 miles on a clear day, and she stood at the top of that rise with the wind in her loose red hair and said, "Oh, Homer, look at it," with a reverence that made him look, really look, at the land he moved through every day without seeing it, and he felt it then the way she was feeling it, the sheer improbable beauty of it. He had been wanting to reach for her hand for 3 Thursdays, and he had not, because he was careful and she deserved to be sure, and he thought he was probably the kind of man who needed to be told things plainly before he would act on them. But on that rise of land, watching her look at the 3-mile view with those green eyes full of honest wonder, she reached for his hand first, simply and without ceremony, and the feeling of her fingers closing around his was so much larger than its small geography that he had to look at the horizon for a moment to get his bearings. "I like it here," she said. "I like you being here," he said. She turned and looked at him, close now, close enough that he could see the exact shade of her eyes, which was greener than he had realized, darker at the edge, and she said, with the frank directness that was entirely and completely her, "Homer Morgan, are you going to kiss me, or are we going to stand here until the snow comes?" He kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss or a questioning kiss. It had been building for 6 weeks, and they both knew exactly what it was, and it was warm and certain, and it tasted faintly of the coffee they had drunk before the walk, and the wind moved around them, and the 3-mile view did whatever 3-mile views do when nobody is watching it. And afterward she pressed her forehead to his shoulder for just a moment, brief and unguarded, before she straightened and looked at him with shining eyes. "About time," she said. He laughed, a full real laugh this time, louder than the one she had heard before, and she looked at him with an expression of pure delight, because she understood with the instinct of someone who paid attention to people, that she was hearing something rare. The weeks that followed were the warmest of Homer Morgan's life, which was a surprising thought for winter, but warmth, he was discovering, had more to do with proximity to Sarah Sutton than with weather. They wrote letters on the days between their visits, proper letters sent by the Caldwell mail because 12 miles was 12 miles, and her letters were long and vivid, and made him laugh out loud alone in his kitchen, and his letters were shorter and more considered. But she told him once that she read each one 3 times and kept them in the Bible on her shelf, because that was the closest thing to sacred she had for holding things she did not want to lose. He went to church on Sundays, which he had not done with any regularity in years, and it was transparently obvious to every person in the Caldwell congregation exactly why, because Sarah sat in the 3rd pew on the left side and always made room. Mrs. Ellison at the dry goods store told Randall Prout that she had never seen Homer Morgan look so awake, and Randall, who had known this was coming from the moment he saw Homer staring across the Whitmore barn in October, smiled with the insufferable satisfaction of a man whose matchmaking required no effort whatsoever. It was in January of 1880 that trouble arrived, as trouble has a habit of doing, uninvited and at the worst possible moment. A man named Carter Lyle had been eyeing Sarah Sutton's homestead since before her father died. He was a land speculator of the type that had become uncomfortably common along the Kishom Trail corridor in those years, men with money from eastern banks and a view of Kansas land as inventory rather than home. He had made her an offer twice, once during her father's illness and once in the summer of 1878. And she had refused both times with the kind of polite but absolute clarity that should have ended the conversation permanently. But Carter Lyle was a man who heard a woman's refusal as a negotiation position rather than a decision, and in January of 1880, he arrived at Sarah Sutton's door with 2 associates and a piece of paper that he claimed was a lien notice from a Wichita bank. Sarah was alone when they came, and she read the paper twice and told Carter Lyle with perfect steadiness that she had no such debt to any Wichita bank, and that he was welcome to provide documentation of the original loan instrument, because she kept her father's accounts, and she knew precisely what had been borrowed and what had been paid. Carter Lyle's smile was the kind that did not reach his eyes. He told her she had 30 days to vacate or to pay a figure that represented roughly twice the value of the homestead, and he and his associates left, and Sarah Sutton sat at her kitchen table for approximately 10 minutes with her hands flat on the wood, and then she went and saddled her horse and rode 12 miles east in January cold. Homer opened the door to find her on his step at 3 in the afternoon, her cheeks red from the cold, her green eyes clear and furious. She told him what had happened with the precise economy of someone who was very angry and had decided that efficiency was more useful than display. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Let me see the paper." She had brought it with her folded in her coat pocket. He read it carefully. He was no lawyer, but he had dealt with enough land business to know what a legitimate lien notice looked like, and there were things wrong with this one that he could identify. The bank seal was not in the proper location, and the document number was in a format he had not seen on any legitimate Kansas banking instrument. He looked up at her. "This is constructed," he said. "I know," she said. "We need to go to Wichita," he said, "to the actual bank, and we need to speak to the county recorder. Your land title needs to be verified at the source." She nodded. "I know that too," she said. "I just needed someone else to see it and tell me I wasn't wrong to trust my own eyes." He set the paper down on the table between them. He looked at her very directly. "You are never wrong to trust your own eyes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Some of the fury went out of her face, replaced by something more complicated and more genuine. "Homer," she said. "We'll go to Wichita," he said. "I'll come with you." "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't," he said. "I want to." They went to Wichita by train 3 days later, which required Homer to arrange for Randall Pruitt to look after the cattle, which Randall agreed to with such immediate and uncomplicated willingness that Homer suspected he had been waiting for the request. They spent the morning at the Wichita branch of the First Commercial Bank of Kansas and discovered, as Homer had suspected, that no such lien existed in their records. The document was fraudulent, constructed by Carter Lyle using a combination of a real bank letterhead he had obtained by some means and fabricated loan details. The bank manager, a thin, precise man named Mr. Waverly, was visibly agitated by the use of his institution's name and wrote out a letter of clarification on the spot with 3 copies. They spent the afternoon at the county land recorder's office, where Sarah Sutton's title to the homestead was confirmed clear and undisputed, a fact that the clerk presented with the cheerful officialness of someone who enjoyed giving good news. And then they walked out into the Wichita afternoon with 3 copies of the bank letter and a certified copy of the land title. And Sarah stopped on the sidewalk and let out a breath so long and deep that it was clearly one she had been holding for 3 days. "It's all right," Homer said quietly. "I know," she said. "I knew it would be, but knowing something and feeling it are 2 different things." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was in the neighborhood. "Thank you for coming with me. Thank you for letting me," he said. She took his arm then, properly, as they walked back toward the train depot, and several people on the Wichita street looked at them as they passed. A tall, quiet man and a bright-haired woman walking close together. And if anyone noticed anything worth noting, it was probably the particular quality of their attention to each other, the way they moved with the unconscious adjustment of people who have already begun to exist in the same gravity. When they returned to Caldwell, Homer went with Sarah to see the county sheriff, a solid and unhurried man named Sheriff Dale Huckworth, who had been keeping Caldwell's peace for 11 years. Sheriff Huckworth read the fraudulent document, read Mr. Waverly's letter, and looked at Carter Lyle's name at the bottom with an expression that suggested this was not the first time Carter Lyle had appeared in a complaint on his desk, though he said nothing specific. He told Sarah he would be looking into the matter and that she should come to him immediately if Carter Lyle or his associates appeared on her property again. Carter Lyle did not appear again. Homer later learned, through the efficient information network that was small-town Kansas in 1880, that Sheriff Huckworth had paid a visit to Mr. Lyle and that the conversation had apparently been persuasive enough to prompt Carter Lyle to redirect his land interests to a different county entirely. Whether this was the result of legal pressure or of Sheriff Huckworth's personal gravity, which was considerable, Homer did not ask, and Sheriff Huckworth did not volunteer. Sarah's homestead was safe. The whole episode had lasted 3 weeks from first knock to final resolution, and what it had left in its wake, besides relief and a certified land title, was the knowledge that Homer Morgan would get on a train in January cold without being asked twice. And Sarah Sutton thought about that knowledge frequently in the weeks that followed, and each time she thought about it, something certain settled further into place inside her. February was cold and clear, and the letters between them grew longer from his side and shorter from hers, not from diminishing affection, but because she had discovered that fewer words were sometimes more honest, the way a room with fewer furnishings sometimes shows its structure better. He came every Thursday and every Sunday now, and there was no pretense anymore that the Thursdays were about fence posts. They were about sitting together in her kitchen, while the snow moved outside the window, and talking about everything and nothing, and sometimes not talking at all, which had become as comfortable between them as the talking, maybe more so. He had a way, when something she said moved him, of going very still for a moment, just a fraction of a beat, before he responded. She had learned to watch for it. It was her favorite thing about him, that involuntary pause, that evidence that she was getting through to something real. He had a way, when something delighted her, of watching her face with an expression she could not entirely name, that was fond and careful in something else, something that she thought might be wonder, as if she was still somehow surprising him, which she found both touching and amusing because she was not. She knew, a particularly surprising person, she was exactly what she appeared to be, and if that was wonderful to him, then she thought he must have spent too long among people who were not what they appeared. In March he asked her to marry him. He did not do it at dinner or in the church or with any assembled audience. He did it on a Thursday afternoon, standing in her kitchen while she was making bread because her hands always needed something to do when she was thinking, and he said, simply and without preamble, "Sarah, I would like to marry you. I would like to very much, and I would like to know if you feel the same way about it." She stopped working the dough. She looked at him. Her hands were covered in flour, and there was a smear of it on her cheek where she had pushed her hair back. He was looking at her with the expression she could not name, and she thought that whatever was in his eyes right now was the realest thing she had ever been looked at with. "I do feel the same way about it," she said. "Good," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had thought very carefully about what he wanted and was resolved in it. She laughed, and it was the full-belly laugh, the harvest dance laugh, loud and honest and unguarded, and she closed the distance between them and kissed him with her flour-covered hands and got flour on his shirt and his jaw, and he did not seem to mind at all. They were married in the Caldwell Church on a Saturday in April of 1880, which happened to be a warm day, the kind of warm that Kansas produces in April as a kind of promise after the winter, the air smelling of turned earth and green things deciding to be green again. Martha Whitmore cried during the ceremony with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a woman who had seen the whole thing coming since October and had been waiting patiently for this moment. Randall Prout sat in the front row with the expression of a man who deserved credit and was not getting it, which was fine. He was used to it. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had taken in and let out and taken in again over the years since her mother passed, and it fit her now as if it had been made for her, white cotton with eyelet lace at the collar that had gone very slightly ivory with age, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers from the earliest spring bloomers she had found along the creek, because she had not been able to afford hothouse flowers and had not wanted them anyway. Homer wore the blue chambray shirt, the one Mrs. Ellison had said brought out his eyes, pressed for the occasion, and a dark vest he had purchased specifically for this day. His brown hair was combed back and he had actually managed to shave, and he stood at the front of the church and watched Sarah walk down the aisle, and his expression was so transparently, helplessly full of her that half the women in attendance thought he might not have enough composure to get through the ceremony, though he did, of course, because he was Homer Morgan and composure was his natural state. He simply felt it very deeply, and anyone watching could see every bit of it. When the minister, a young man named Reverend Aldridge who had come to Caldwell the year before and had known Reverend Sutton only by reputation, but had honored him by performing this service for his daughter with evident care, asked Homer if he took this woman. Homer said, "I do," in a voice that carried to the back of the church without effort and without wavering, and Sarah, who had composed herself through the entire procession and had expected to continue composing herself through the vows, found that her eyes filled entirely at the sound of it, just those two words in his quiet, steady voice, and she did not try to blink it away. They moved on to his property, which was the practical decision for two people who needed to run one cattle operation, but they kept Sarah's homestead as well, working both with the combined energy of two people who knew the land and were not afraid of it. She brought the bookshelves and the piano and the jar that she always kept filled with whatever was in season: wild flowers in spring, dried corn in autumn, bare winter branches when nothing else was available. She planted the kitchen garden on the south-facing side of the house where the light was better, and the beehives came too, all three of them, relocated with what she called strategic urgency, and only 2 instances of genuine alarm. He built her a reading corner in the house, a proper one, with a chair that was wider than necessary, and a lamp positioned for exactly the right angle. He had spent 3 evenings measuring the chair specifications before he went to the furniture maker in Wichita, and he had not mentioned to Sarah that he was doing it. And when she discovered it one morning in early June, already assembled and positioned, she stood in the doorway of the room for a long moment before she turned around and found him in the kitchen, and said his name, just his name, with a particular quality that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The summer of 1880 was a good one, the kind of summer that Kansas occasionally offers as apology for its winters, long and golden and productive. The cattle were healthy, the garden was abundant, the beehives produced more honey than they had anticipated, and Sarah, who had been managing accounts since she was 12, applied herself to the combined operation of both properties with an organization and efficiency that Homer, who had always been haphazard about his own books, found both admirable and faintly humbling. She set up a ledger system that showed clearly what each enterprise was earning and spending, and she sat down with Homer on Sunday evenings to go through it together, which was not a romantic activity in any obvious sense, but which Homer found he looked forward to with unreasonable pleasure, because it was her, beside him at the table, with the lamp between them and her pencil moving precise and sure, and the fact that the subject was accounting was entirely beside the point. They had disagreements, of course, because they were real people with real temperaments. She thought things through out loud, which sometimes filled the air with half-formed thoughts that he had to sort through to find the conclusion. He thought things through silently, which sometimes left her with no idea what was happening in his mind when she needed to know. She moved quickly when she had decided something. He circled a decision from multiple angles before he committed to it. There were 2 or 3 evenings that first year when one or both of them went to bed with the particular careful silence of people who are in the middle of something, and are choosing to sleep on it rather than push through it tired. But they were good at repair in the same quiet way they were good at most things. He was not a man who nursed a grievance past its expiration date, and she was not a woman who confused an argument with a verdict on the relationship. They found each other in the mornings with the fresh willingness of people who had genuinely thought it over and come back sure, and she would sometimes say, without preamble, "I was too loud about it yesterday," and he would say, without deflection, "I was too slow to say what I was thinking," and that was usually enough. November of 1880 brought the first deep cold and the announcement, made by Sarah at the breakfast table with her hands around a coffee cup, and her eyes bright with a mixture of happiness and something that looked like equal parts excitement and terror, that she was expecting a child in the spring. Homer set down his coffee cup very carefully. He looked at her. She looked back at him with those green eyes that, even after 10 months, still had the capacity to rearrange something in his chest. "In the spring," he said. "April or May," she said. "I think April, though I've been wrong before about timing." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He did not say anything for a moment. He was thinking, she could tell, carefully and completely, the way he always thought about things that mattered. "Are you well?" he asked. "Right now, are you well?" She smiled. "Very well," she said. "Tired, a little strange sometimes, but well." He turned her hand over and held it properly, his thumb moving once across her knuckles in a gesture that was almost unbearably tender for its smallness. "April," he said quietly. "April," she confirmed. It was a boy, born in the first week of April in 1881. A late-night arrival after a long day that aged Homer Morgan several years in the span of 12 hours. He had stood outside the bedroom door for the entirety of it because Mrs. Whitmore, who had delivered half the children in Caldwell County, had told him firmly that his presence inside would not be helpful, and he had believed her, though the believing did not make the standing easier. He had held every conceivable posture of a man who is trying very hard not to come apart at the seams, and when the door opened and Mrs. Whitmore came out with an expression of satisfied practicality and said, "You have a fine, healthy boy, and your wife is asking for you." He had crossed the room and taken Sarah's hand, and looked at the small, red-faced person in the crook of her arm, and the feeling that arrived was one he had no existing vocabulary for, vast and quiet and permanent, like the feeling he sometimes got standing on a high piece of land at sunset, the sense of something too large to measure. "He looks like you," Sarah said, studying the baby with the frank, evaluative gaze she brought to everything. "He looks like a baby," Homer said, because the baby looked, in his honest opinion, primarily like a baby. She laughed, and the baby startled slightly at the sound, and then, as if he recognized it already, settled. They named him Thomas, for Sarah's father, and Thomas Morgan grew into a sturdy and determined boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's unhurried temperament, which Sarah found both touching and occasionally maddening. The years moved on in the good way that years move when they are full. Caldwell grew, as Kansas towns did in those years, the cattle trade bringing money and men, and eventually the tension that came with both. The Kishom Trail runs, which had been the lifeblood of towns like Caldwell through the 1870s, were beginning their long decline by the early 1880s as railheads moved west and the cattle market shifted, and the men who had built their lives around the drives had to think carefully about what came next. Homer thought carefully. He diversified in the quiet, thorough way he did everything, adding more permanent stock, improving the winter feed operation, and eventually, at Sarah's suggestion, which had begun as an observation over the ledger one Sunday evening, and developed into a full proposal over 3 weeks of her working it through out loud, establishing a small but reliable dairy operation that proved considerably more stable than the volatile cattle market. "You were right about the dairy," he told her, on an evening in 1883 when the ledger showed it clearly. "I was right about the dairy," she agreed, with entirely unfeigned satisfaction. He looked at her over the ledger with the expression she had been seeing for 3 years now and still could not entirely name, though she had added a new element to her understanding of it. It was wonder, yes, and fond, yes, but it was also, she thought, a kind of gratitude, specific and ongoing, the gratitude of someone who knows they receive something beyond their calculation. Thomas turned 2 and then 3, and in the spring of 1884 Sarah was again expecting, which she announced with somewhat less terror and somewhat more simple joy, having established to her satisfaction that she was capable of this, and that the process, while considerable, was not beyond her management. This one was a girl, born in September on a clear-skied morning that felt like a gift, and they named her Clara for Sarah's mother. Clara arrived with more hair than Thomas had possessed at birth and a pair of lungs that Mrs. Whitmore praised with professional admiration, and Sarah looked at her daughter with an expression that Homer observed from the doorway before she saw him, a tender private expression that he would carry always. Thomas, at age 3, regarded his sister with the cautious assessment of a person, evaluating a new and uncertain element in an otherwise predictable environment, and then gradually, and without ceremony, began including her in his world, which expressed itself primarily in the form of sitting beside her crib and telling her about things in the solemn, instructive voice of someone who has a great deal of important information to convey to someone who cannot yet respond. Homer, watching this from across the room, said nothing about it for a long time, and then one evening said to Sarah, "He's talking to her every afternoon." "I know," Sarah said. "He's been explaining the chickens to her for a week." Homer was quiet for a moment. "She seems interested," he offered. Sarah looked at him and then looked at Thomas, who was currently gesturing in the direction of the window in a manner that suggested the chickens were involved even from this distance, and she pressed her face briefly against Homer's shoulder in the way she occasionally did when something was too much and too good at the same time. The homestead that had been Sarah's father's land they eventually incorporated more formally into the operation, converting the main house into a proper bunkhouse for the 2 ranch hands Homer had taken on as the operation expanded. A man named Jesse Morno, who was quiet and capable and had come up from Texas, and a younger man named August Hale, who was 20 years old and earnest to a degree that made Sarah think of a puppy that has not yet grown into its feet. She liked them both. She made sure they were fed properly and paid fairly and treated with the respect that good work deserved, and both men would later, in separate conversations to separate people, describe working for the Morgans as the best employment they had held, and Homer Morgan as the kind of man you wanted to work for because he expected no more from you than he expected from himself, which was a great deal, but it was always clear and always fair. The Christmas of 1885 was white and generous. The children were 4 and 1, Thomas solemn with the particular gravity of a 4-year-old who has been told this is an important occasion and has taken this responsibility very seriously. Clara too young to understand the occasion, but old enough to be delighted by the color and the noise and the fact that so many people were in her house. Martha Whitmore had come, and Randall Prout, and the Donovan brothers, who had aged into their 50s with the resigned dignity of men who understood they were going to be the Donovan brothers until the end of their days. Old Pete Calloway, the fiddler from Wichita, had not been in health this year, which was a sadness, but his grandson had inherited enough of the talent to fill the evening with music, and the house was warm and full. Randall Prout, who had consumed a quantity of cider that had loosened whatever remained of his natural restraint, cornered Homer in the kitchen at one point and said, with the emotional directness of a man who felt feelings very strongly and typically suppressed them but had decided tonight was different, "You're the happiest I've ever seen a person, Homer, and I mean that." Homer looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. "You were going to sit on that barrel all night," Randall said. "At the Whitmore dance, you were going to sit there and go home and never know." Homer considered this. "I was going to leave twice," he said. "What stopped you?" Randall asked. Homer was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen doorway he could see the sitting room where Sarah was holding Clara on her lap and talking to Martha Whitmore, and Thomas was sitting at her feet with a wooden horse that had been his Christmas gift, and the lamplight was on all of them, golden and steady. "She knocked over the lemonade table," he said, "and laughed harder than anyone." Randall considered this as a complete explanation, which it was, and nodded, and Homer refilled both their cider cups and they walked back into the warmth of the sitting room. The years that followed were built on foundations solid enough to bear the weight of real life, which arrived, as it always does, with its mixture of grace and difficulty. In 1886, they lost 2 head of cattle to a disease that swept through the region, and the winter that followed was harder than anticipated, and there were months that required careful management and sacrifice of comfort for stability, which Sarah navigated with the ledger and Homer navigated with the labor, and they came through it without debt and without bitterness. In 1888, Sarah's bee colonies had expanded to 7 hives, and the honey operation had become reliable enough to sell at market, which was her project entirely, and which she pursued with the competitive satisfaction of someone who was good at something and knew it. Jessie Morneau married a woman from Wichita in 1887 and brought her to live in the bunkhouse. And Maria Morneau was the kind of addition to a household that improves everything around her without apparent effort. A practical and warm woman who became Sarah's particular friend in the way that women become friends when they recognize in each other the same particular quality of will. August Hale eventually took a job on a larger spread near Dodge City and left with the good wishes of everyone. And the ranch hand who replaced him, a man named Silas Cooper, was older and more experienced and fit the operation with less drama if also less endearment. Thomas Morgan, at 7 years old, was already showing the specific combination of his parents' traits that would define him, his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was, as Sarah observed one evening, possibly the most formidable combination a person could have. She said this approvingly. Homer agreed. Clara, at 3, had determined views on every subject within her awareness and the vocal capacity to make these views known to the furthest corners of the house, which had caused Homer to remark once with entire sincerity that she reminded him of someone, and Sarah had thrown a dish-towel at him, which was the most aggressive thing she ever threw at anyone and which landed on his shoulder and slid to the floor, so the threat was largely metaphorical. "She gets it from you," Sarah said. "The volume, absolutely," Homer agreed. "I was going to say the certainty," Sarah said, "but yes, also the volume." He caught her hand as she came past him in the kitchen, the way he sometimes did, casual and certain, and pulled her back one step so she was beside him, and he looked at her for a moment with the expression she had spent 8 years understanding and had come to the conclusion was simply love. That was what the expression was. It was love in its most specific and enduring form, the kind that knows what it has and holds it without grasping. 8 years in April, he said. It was November and he had been thinking about it. 8 years, she said. It goes fast, he said, which was not a complaint, just an observation. And slow, she said, both at once, like all the good things. He moved his thumb across her hand in the old gesture, the one that had happened first at that kitchen table when she had told him there was going to be a baby, and she leaned against him for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen, where the coffee had nearly finished brewing on the stove, and the children's voices came distantly from somewhere in the house, and outside the window the November plains stretched away in the long amber light of late afternoon. The years moved. Thomas grew tall and serious, with his father's way of listening and his mother's way of saying exactly what he meant, and he took to the land with an affinity that Homer recognized as native rather than learned, the kind of relationship with the earth that is not taught but recognized. By the time Thomas was 10, he could read the weather 3 days out with a reliability that made even the experienced Jessie Morneau take notice, and he had opinions about the cattle that were frequently correct, which he expressed with the measured confidence of someone who has checked his own conclusions carefully before offering them. Clara grew into the fullness of her own considerable character, which was her mother's character in most respects, but with the addition of a particular creative streak that seemed to have come from somewhere in the line that nobody could quite trace. She drew things, on any available surface, careful detailed drawings of the animals and the landscape and the people around her, and when Sarah found a way to get her proper paper and charcoal pencils from the Wichita merchant, Clara spent 3 years producing work of increasing skill that Sarah displayed on the walls of the house with the pride of a woman who knows what she is looking at. The Caldwell years were changing, as all years change. The cattle drives that had defined the town were mostly finished by the late 1880s. The era of the Great Kishom Trail runs giving way to the fenced and settled landscape that barbed wire and homesteaders had made permanent. The wild quality of the town, the quality that had made Saturday nights occasionally loud and sometimes dangerous in the years before Homer and Sarah had built their life there, had quieted into the ordinary hum of a plains community that was settling into its own middle age. The saloons still operated, but the cowboys passing through were fewer, and the permanent families who had stayed and built and planted were the defining character of the place now. Homer and Sarah were among the oldest established couples in the area by 1890, though they were both still only in their early 40s, which struck Homer as significant information about the brevity of the period they had all been through together. He said this to Sarah one evening, that he was 42 years old and felt he had been young here just recently, and she looked at him with the honest directness she had never once lost, not in 10 years of marriage, and said, "We were young here just recently." It was just very full, he thought about that. Very full, he agreed. In the spring of 1891, they planted a grove of apple trees along the south-facing slope below the house, a project that had been in discussion for 3 years and had finally moved from the ledger to the earth. The planting of apple trees was a particular statement, because apple trees do not produce meaningfully for several years, and planting them was an act of faith in the continuation of things, in the future that would be there to eat the apples. Thomas, now 10, helped dig the holes with the thoroughness he applied to everything. Clara, at 7, mostly supervised and offered detailed opinions on the placement that were, Sarah noted privately, often correct. They dug 12 trees in a row, 12 holes in the warm April earth, and Homer stood at the end of the row when the last one was done and looked down the line of small bare whips, each one staked and tied against the spring wind, and Sarah came and stood beside him. "They'll take a few years," he said. "We have the time," she said. He put his arm around her, there in the April afternoon with the earth still dark with turned soil and the children moving somewhere behind them, and she leaned into his side in the easy way of someone who has been leaning there long enough that it feels like natural geography. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I think about that night at the Whitmore barn," she said, "the dance, and I think, what if I had left at 11 like most people? What if I had gone home at a sensible hour like a sensible person, and I would have driven past you on the road probably and never known who you were, not really." He was quiet for a moment. "I had my hat on twice," he said. "I was going to leave twice." She looked up at him. "What stopped you?" "You," he said simply. "You stopped me. I couldn't stop watching you." She looked at him with the full force of those green eyes in the April light, and the years of their life together were in her expression. The Thursday visits and the flower-covered kitchen proposal, and the train to Wichita in the January cold, and the long Sunday evenings over the ledger, and the 2 children who were somewhere behind them right now, scuffing through the turned earth and probably getting it on their good clothes. "Homer Morgan," she said, with the particular tone she reserved for saying his full name, which she did on significant occasions and which always sounded to him like something being confirmed. "Sarah Sutton Morgan," he said. She laughed, the old laugh, the harvest dance laugh, full and unguarded and loud, startling a pair of sparrows from the fence post 40 feet away, and Thomas looked up from his earth examination to assess the situation and then returned to it, having determined the laugh was celebratory rather than urgent. Clara looked up and laughed too, because Clara had inherited the laugh and always responded to it the way a bell responds to a nearby bell. The apple trees grew. They took several years, as apple trees do, but they grew with the patient inevitability of things planted in good soil by people who understood the value of waiting. By 1895, they were producing small tart apples of no particular famous variety, but of considerable actual quality, and Sarah made preserves from them every autumn and gave them to Martha Whitmore, who was 72 now, and had developed a particular affection for the tart ones. Martha Whitmore had been at the harvest dance and had watched it all begin, and she considered the preserves a form of proper tribute, which Sarah would not have argued. Thomas Morgan, at 14, was already doing the work of a grown man on the operation, and doing it with a gravity that sometimes made Homer feel he needed to remind the boy that being 14 was permissible and did not require accelerated aging. Thomas responded to these reminders with the patient forbearance of a person who is tolerating well-intentioned advice, which was so precisely his father's expression that Sarah sometimes had to leave the room. Clara Morgan, at 10, had added reading to her drawing, consuming the books on the double-stacked shelves with the systematic appetite of someone who considers a personal library a resource to be completed. She asked Homer questions about books he had not read in years, requiring him to remember them, and she asked Sarah questions about things she had read that required discussion. And the dinner table of the Morgan household in those years was an event of considerable conversational density that Jessie Morno, who occasionally joined them when Maria was visiting her sister, described as the most interesting table in the county. Maria and Jessie's son, a boy named Eli who was 1 year younger than Thomas, had become Thomas's particular companion, and the two of them together were a combination of Thomas's methodical certainty and Eli's quick observation that proved surprisingly effective at most things they attempted. Sarah watched their friendship with the warm approval of someone who understands that good companionship is one of the quiet foundations of a life, and she thought about Homer and Randall Prout, about the particular way that some friendships function as infrastructure. Randall Prout had married in 1882 a woman from Oklahoma named Helen, who had made the unlikely pairing work through sheer force of mutual determination. And they had 3 children who were approximately the ages of Thomas and Clara, and who featured in various childhood dramas with the Morgan children over the years. Randall still came over on Sundays occasionally, now with Helen and the children in tow, and the two households together made the kind of Sunday afternoon noise that Homer, who had spent his first 7 years in Kansas in relative quiet, found he had come to not merely tolerate but actively love, in the specific way you love things that are evidence of a life going right. In 1897, Homer and Sarah sat together at the kitchen table that they had sat at hundreds of times, with the lamp between them and her coffee cup at her elbow, and they were not going over the ledger this evening. They were talking, the way they talked on evenings when everything routine had been attended to, and the house was quiet with the children, Thomas 16 and Clara 12, both somewhere in the particular solitude of people who have reached the age where they need the occasional silence of their own room. They were talking about nothing in particular and everything in general, the way you talk when you know someone so completely that the topic is almost incidental. And Homer looked at Sarah across the table, and she was 43 years old, and her dark red hair had threads of silver in it now that she did not attempt to conceal, because she was not that kind of woman, and her green eyes were exactly as he had first seen them across the Whitmore barn. Sharp and direct and full of something that was either amusement or attention or both, and he thought what he had thought before, what he thought regularly and without diminishing conviction, that she was the most magnificent person he had ever encountered, and that the October night in 1879, when he had not left the Whitmore barn, had been the most consequential decision of his life, even though he had not quite made it consciously, even though she had made it for him, really, with the force of her presence across a crowded room and the particular quality of her laugh, and the way she had looked at the lemonade pitcher on the floor and laughed harder than anyone. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, because she had always been able to tell when he was somewhere specific. "The harvest dance," he said. She smiled. The lamplight was on her face, and outside the October wind was moving through the apple trees because it was October again, 17 Octobers after the one where it had all begun. "What about it?" she said. "I was thinking," he said, "that I sat on that barrel all evening and I watched you and I thought you were the most alive person I had ever seen." She was quiet for a moment, Her hands were around her coffee cup, the old habit. "And now," she said. He looked at her. He let the expression happen that he had once tried to contain and had long since stopped trying. The one she had spent years reading and had finally named correctly. Love in its most specific and enduring form. "Now I know it," he said. "I thought it then. Now I know it." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, reversing the old gesture, and her fingers were warm from the coffee cup and her eyes were bright. "Homer," she said. "Sarah," he said. Outside, the October wind moved through the apple trees, and a horse shifted in the barn with a soft, comfortable sound. And somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed quietly. One of the children moving through their evening, and the lamp burned steady between them in the warm kitchen of the life they had built together from a harvest dance and a barrel, and a lemonade table knocked sideways in the best possible way. They stayed at that table for a long time, talking, the lamp burning down slowly around them. Thomas Morgan, at 20, left for a year to work a larger cattle operation near Abilene, which he approached as a deliberate expansion of his knowledge. Returning with skills and observations, he immediately applied to the Morgan operation with the methodical improvement that was his character. He met a young woman in Abilene named Ruth, the daughter of a cattle broker, and brought her home to meet his parents in the autumn of 1901. And Sarah liked her immediately with the accurate instinct of a woman who had never been wrong about people she looked at directly. Ruth was quiet in a different way than Homer was quiet, more inward, a thinker, and she and Thomas together had the quality of two people who had found the particular person suited to their particular way of being. And Sarah recognized it because she had seen that quality in herself, 17 years earlier, and it had looked like a tall, quiet man sitting on a barrel at the Whitmore barn. Thomas and Ruth were married in the Caldwell Church in the spring of 1902. Homer walked beside Sarah to the front pew and they sat together and watched their son stand at the altar with the same composed certainty that Homer had stood there with in 1880. And Sarah reached for Homer's hand in the dim of the church without looking away from her son. And Homer held it, and the minister spoke the words that had been spoken over them 22 years before. Clara Morgan, by this time 20 years old, had gone to Wichita to study, a decision that had required some creative problem-solving around the limited educational opportunities for women in 1900 Kansas, but which Sarah had supported with the full force of her considerable determination, and Homer had supported with the patient, steady backing of a man who understood that his daughter had a mind that needed room. Clara had found a program of formal instruction through the Wichita Academy, studying drawing and design, and her work had developed into something of genuine and recognized quality. She wrote home every week, long letters full of observation and humor, and Sarah read them at the kitchen table in the evening and shared the best parts with Homer, and both of them were privately overwhelmed by the strange particular pride of seeing someone you made from almost nothing become something you could not have imagined. Clara came home for Thomas's wedding looking every inch a young woman of the new century, poised and self-possessed and still unmistakably the child who had told Homer where to plant the apple trees, and she stood in the yard after the ceremony with her parents, one on each side of her, and looked at the house and the grove and the long sweep of the Kansas plains and said, "I miss it, even when I'm here." "You can always come back," Sarah said. "I know," Clara said, "but I don't think I should stay." "Not yet," Homer nodded, the slow, thoughtful nod. "The right time will tell you," he said. She looked at him sideways, the old gesture, the inherited mannerism. "Is that what happened to you?" "With most things," he said. "With your mother the right time was when she walked into the Whitmore barn and I forgot how to leave." Clara looked at her mother. Sarah's expression was the private one, the tender one, the one she did not use for public occasions. "That's a good story," Clara said. "It's a true one," Sarah said. The first decade of the new century moved with the feeling of arrival, of things that had been building settling into what they were always going to become. Thomas and Ruth had a son in 1903, born in late spring, and named him James. And Homer held his first grandchild with the careful reverence of a man who has held things before but not quite this thing, this specific weight of continuity, this evidence that the life he had built was extending past him into time he would not see. The baby had his grandmother's eyes. They were very green. Sarah pointed this out when Homer was holding him, sitting in the wide chair by the window, and Homer looked down at the small face and then up at Sarah and said, "I noticed." She smiled. The slow, certain smile, the small, honest one, not the performance one. "Come sit with us," he said. She came and sat on the arm of the chair, the way she had taken to doing in recent years when they were both near it, leaning against him, his arm coming around her automatic and sure. And little James Morgan regarded the ceiling with the profound absorption of someone experiencing ceilings for the first time. Outside, the Kansas summer was everything Kansas summers could be at their best, wide and warm and golden all the way to the horizon. And the apple trees on the slope were full of this year's fruit. And Thomas was in the field somewhere with Ruth walking beside him. And somewhere in Wichita, Clara was drawing something and would write about it on Sunday. Homer looked at the view from the window, the long, familiar view he had shown Sarah in October of 1879, the 3-mile view from the rise of the East Land, not visible from this window, but in his mind as clear as the day he had seen her stand at the top of it with the wind in her hair and say, "Oh, Homer, look at it." He had looked. He had kept looking. After all these years he was still looking, and every time he looked he saw something worth seeing. Sarah shifted beside him, comfortable and warm, and the baby in his arms made the small, certain sounds of a person already at home in the world. Happy. She asked, the single word she asked him on significant occasions and some insignificant ones, her own private inventory of their life together. He looked at her for a long moment. The October harvest dance, the 12 miles in the cold wagon, the flower on his shirt, the lemonade table on the barn floor, the train to Wichita, the apple trees, the letters in the Bible, the Thursday afternoons and the Sunday ledger evenings and the wide reading chair, and every single day of every single year of the life they had built together from that one unplanned midnight in the Whitmore barn. "I am," he said. "Completely." She pressed her lips briefly to his temple, the old gesture, warm and certain. Outside, the Kansas afternoon opened endlessly in every direction. The same sky, the same land, the same vast and ordinary miracle of a life that had been found and held and made into something good. And the apple trees on the south-facing slope were heavy with fruit, and the year stretched ahead of them, full and unhurried and entirely their own.